So with that and without further delay, let's get to our session in the full and complete data report on our global mapping survey. I am delighted to be joined today by some of our collective members, and I would love for all of them to introduce themselves. So Graciana, I'm going to head over to you first, if you could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Uma. So my name is Graciana Fu. As Uma mentioned, I am a volunteer member of the Racial Equity Index. I am a data scientist by trade with a public health background and have been supporting the Racial Equity Index in development of the survey and analysis of the survey. Thank you all for joining, and I will pass it on.
Thank you so much, Graciana. Chantel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Chantal Hildebrand, and I am a member of the Working Group for the Racial Equity Index. I work predominantly in gender equity and racial equity and justice in the global development sector, as well as also more locally in the United States. And I've been working with the Racial Equity Index predominantly on the global mapping survey and more so on our research side. So I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Chantal. And Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're located and wherever you're joining us from. My name is Alyssa Bovell. I am also a working group member of the Racial Equity Index, and I'm really glad to be here. I have about 8 or so years working in this sector, and my background has been predominantly on issues of gender equity as well as addressing gender-based violence. I also work domestically, where I'm based in the state of Georgia, in the United States, on issues of reproductive justice and racial equity. So I'm really glad to be here with you and to share with other collective members around the findings from our global mapping survey.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. So first, I want to start by introducing the Racial Equity Index collective. As you saw in our video, the Racial Equity Index was formed by a dedicated group, a global group of BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, who wanted to explore the lack of a need for racial equity within the international development sector. Since July of 2020, we have been and currently all are volunteers. And this webinar that you are participating in is due to the sweat equity of our BIPOC-led collective. This data report that we released just at the tail end of last week is also because of the sweat equity of our BIPOC-led collective. We exist as the Racial Equity Index because we know that the global development sector, which was built literally to uphold white supremacy and colonialism, has a very poor track record as it relates to engaging with issues of racial equity. And we know this because the global development sector was literally built to reify some of these same systemic issues that we are now fighting against. So we have over 50 years of experience within global development within our collective. And as you heard in our video, every single one of our collective members have experienced racism within global development throughout moving through the different roles that we've had and the different experiences that we've had within the global development sector. So we are here to hold the global development sector accountable. We are building a racial equity index for that very purpose, so that we can collectively dismantle all forms of systemic racism within global development. The work that we are doing is intersectional, it is intentional, it is authentic, and is being led by the people who have lived experience and who have been impacted most directly by the harmful practices and the beliefs in global development. And so that is who the Racial Equity Index is. That is why we are here. That is why you all are here, so that you can hear from us on the findings of our global mapping survey and the full data report that we just released last week. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa so she can take you all through the global mapping survey. I'm going to just...
Great, thanks, Uma. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. as a first step towards creating the racial equity index, our working group decided to reach out to organizations and individuals working in this sector to really identify key indicators that should be included in the racial equity index. And so this work of building the index means, as Uma mentioned, some of our core principles around transparency really means that we're seeking responses and centering those most impacted and affected by systemic racism within the sector. We can go to the next slide. And for the purposes of the Global Mapping Survey, the Racial Equity Index identified a selection of 11 key indicators and developed accompanying definitions, which were related to how an organization or organizations in the sector operate internally and externally. You can read more about this in our about this whole process in our methodology, but it's really important, and I really want to emphasize that our entire process, and especially developing these indicators and their definitions, were, as well as the survey overall, were peer reviewed within our collective and then by our external body of peer reviewers. That's a really important point that I want to note as people are reviewing our work. We can go to the next slide. Another step in our process was to reach out to our networks to solicit support from volunteers to translate the survey into as many languages as possible to ensure the survey's accessibility. We were able to make the survey available in 10 languages. And through this sort of translation process, we also engaged in a series of reflections and conversations around the role of language in this sector, as well as the impacts that colonialism has on the languages that we're using and how the concepts around race and racial equity are translated. And you can read more about this in a blog post that we produced last year. I'll add a link to the chat about that as well. We can go to the next slide. And then something that I think is also a really important feat of our process, we disseminated the survey to our networks. 30 partner organizations that sort of operate within the sector also posted the survey on a number of social media platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. And as well as we disseminated through our Racial Equity Index newsletter to reach as many people as possible that are working in the sector. We also opted to use Google Forms as a platform for the survey and all its translations, just giving the accessibility as well as the user friendliness. We can go to the next slide. And then finally, I just want to note, as we continue to move through the presentation today, it's just really important that we share that we have both quantitative and qualitative data that was collected and disseminated as part of our survey findings. And we just want to emphasize that it's really important that those who are engaging with our work and are engaging in these findings, that they shouldn't isolate or pull out specific data points without connecting it to the larger context of the work that we're doing, as well as some of the analysis that we note across the qualitative and quantitative data. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it on to the next presenter, Graciana.
Thanks, Alyssa. So I will go through the analysis for the qualitative responses, what we call their coding process. You can go to the next slide. So our main goal for this section was to identify the common themes from our qualitative responses. As we previously mentioned, our survey has been split up into the quantitative section, which includes the demographic information and the indicator questions. The second section is just on the qualitative questions. So we included two primary questions regarding respondents' personal accounts of witnessing racism in a development context and or experiencing racism in a development context. As I mentioned, I'm only going to talk about the qualitative side of things. The quantitative section is in our final report and up on our website. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can head over to our website and read that section. I'll follow with the process that we conducted for this analysis. And it looks really simple. There are only like 4 bullet points, but I will say it did take quite a bit of time and work to go through all of these qualitative responses. So we received almost 800 responses from all over the world for the entire survey. Not every single person provided a qualitative response to our questions, but there were a significant number of responses, so it did take a bit of time. The first round of our analysis was just a basic reading of all of the responses to these two questions on witnessing and experiencing racism. And we just wanted to get a better sense of what the different themes were that people were talking about in their responses, what stories people were telling. And I will say, while this seems pretty simple, it was, I don't want to speak for everyone else in the index, but I think this was the most difficult stage of analysis. Everyone who responded to these questions gave us very, very personal stories about witnessing racism in their workplace, in racist accounts that have been directed towards them by coworkers and by other people in power at their organizations. And I think it was pretty difficult for us to go through and just read over and over again pretty traumatic responses to these questions. I think we're all very, very grateful for the respondents for providing responses to these questions. But I will say, yeah, this first round was very difficult. So we did the initial reading of all of the responses, and we identified kind of our key themes that stood out to us as we were going through and reading these. From those key themes, we met and discussed how we actually wanted to tag or code the responses. And it came up from many of the folks who read through these responses that they correlated pretty closely with the 11 indicators that we had already created for the quantitative section of our survey. Now, we didn't want our perception of what these indicators were and what those definitions, what the indicator definitions were to kind of color our analysis of the qualitative responses. But we did find that it just fit so well that we used that framework to conduct the rest of our analysis. So with those indicators, within each one, we created different subcodes. So for example, we had the workplace culture indicator that just goes into workplace culture of an organization. And within that indicator, we had subcodes like racial abuse, gaslighting, tokenism, and a risk of reprisal, and a couple of other subcodes that I think Chantal will actually go into in our key findings section. Once we created those subcodes, we did the coding. So we reread through all of the responses from our qualitative data and coded each response with the different subcodes that we had identified. I'll note that each response could have had multiple subcodes, so each response was not limited to just the one code. In our last round, we did a pretty significant review of all of the coding that was done. So there were about 5 or 6 of us, I believe, that did this whole process of reading and coding, and as a way to kind of check ourselves, we reviewed each other's codes. So we took a section of the responses that we had never read before and looked at the relative codes that our other colleagues had already provided and just checked that the codes matched up with the responses. I will say we also sent that coding process through our peer reviewers. So we do have a separate peer review committee that we go to regularly just to make sure that the work that we're doing, the research that we're doing is peer reviewed and kind of validated by a secondary board of people. So that is the basic analysis process. From there on, I think Chantal will talk about our key findings, but I will stop there and pass it on.
Thank you so much, Gratiana, and thank you, Alyssa, for taking us through what the Global Mapping Survey was all about, as well as also the coding process. So the Global Mapping Survey, if we can move to slide 12, the Global Mapping Survey is resulted in 791 responses in 10 languages from 83 countries. The demographic data highlights the countries where the Global Mapping Survey received the top responses. The top responses by number of years working in the sector, as well as how self-selected gender and racial identities respond across the most ranked indicators. Of the 791 respondents, 57% were based in the USA, Great Britain, and Canada. In addition, 32% of the survey respondents self-identified as white women, which correlates with the general global development sector data, where white women currently represent the largest population working in the sector. Next slide, please. As my colleagues already shared, the key purpose of this global mapping survey was to understand the different ways racism shows up in the global development sector based on the experiences of people who work, volunteer, or participate in the sector, and to identify some of the key indicators that can help measure racial equity within and across organizations and the global development sector as a whole. Next slide. To begin to unpack these indicators, survey respondents were asked to rank 11 indicators that resonate or matter most to them when they think about racial equity in their organizations in the global development sector. The Racial Equity Index Working Group also looked into how the importance of these indicators shift based on respondents' different and multiple identities, experiences, positionalities, and geographies. Based on the quantitative data, workplace culture, defined as the enabling environment that fosters inclusive and equitable spaces or catalyzes harm, and leadership, defined as the makeup of an organization's leadership team, whether or not leadership is at all levels, from management to senior leadership to executive board, is representative and inclusive of groups and communities that the organization works with, were ranked as the highest. Programming, how an organization engages impacted populations in programming, from strategy and design to implementation through monitoring and evaluation, was often ranked as part of the top 5 indicators, along with fund allocations and grant-making principles. How organizations, specifically funders, foundations, philanthropists, and individual donors, determine how to allocate funding, and if their funding criteria centers principles of racial equity from a grant-making perspective. When we took a deeper dive into how respondents have experienced and or witnessed racism within the sector, some of these indicators shined through more than others. Next slide, please. A total of 137 respondents, about 17.1%, shared stories of experiencing racism, while 164 respondents, 20.7%, shared accounts of witnessing racism. From our analysis, it is clear that there is a relationship between experiencing racism and witnessing racism. Of the 65% of respondents who shared an experience of racism, 98% of those respondents also reported witnessing racism. In coding these responses, workplace culture and human resources were coded the most frequently. Next slide. Under workplace culture, we identified a total of 6 subcodes, from gaslighting, tokenism, exclusion from decision-making, prioritizing white voices, to risk of reprisal. Appearing 269 times in our analysis of the qualitative data, racial abuse was the top subcode under the indicator. Next slide. There was an overwhelming number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color respondents who indicated experiencing various forms of racial abuse in the workplace, including interpersonal and institutional racism. These instances of racism included experiences of toxic workplaces where silencing, harassment, bullying, racialized microaggressions, misogynoir, and allegations of sexual abuse are commonplace. Another subcode under the workplace culture that respondents highlighted in the qualitative data was the prioritization of white voices. In some cases, this referred to favoring or privileging input of white colleagues over the voices of BIPOC staff, which diminishes and silences the knowledge and input of BIPOC colleagues. Some respondents described this as them sharing an idea or making a point in the workplace, and that point only being acknowledged when one of their white colleagues says the same thing. Notably, there were several instances under this indicator where some respondents noted that there were too many experiences of racism to share in the survey. Through the process of completing the survey, some respondents shared remembering experiences that were blocked out, which may be a coping mechanism or survival tactic to function in the workplace. This is also an indication that this is just a snapshot of the experiences of racism in the workplace, and that the true extent of racism that BIPOC individuals are facing may exceed what was captured here. Next slide. The second most coded indicator in the short answer section of the survey was HR management, which refers to whether the organization has systems and processes that are focused on equitable hiring practices, strategies, and measurable goals for strengthening diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and procedures in place to protect employees from workplace retaliation, such as safeguarding or whistleblowing procedures. The subcodes that emerged were discrimination in hiring practices, inequitable treatment of local versus international staff, limited opportunities for advancement for BIPOC staff, and no HR protection. Next slide. Of the 167 responses that fell into this code, 85 of these responses centered on people who experienced racism in HR management in the global development sector. Of these responses, discrimination in hiring practices was the most coded subcode for this indicator, closely followed by limited opportunities for advancement for BIPOC staff. Respondents of color spoke about how it's harder for them to get a job in the global development sector compared to their white colleagues with the same or less experience in education. In addition, they found themselves getting passed over for advancement opportunities or had to be overqualified to be considered for a position, which is not the same experience that their white colleagues are having. Of the 82 respondents who witnessed racism in HR management in the global development sector, they often described how local staff are treated differently than international staff coming from the West or working in Latin America, Asia, or Africa, but not being from that country, those continents. Oftentimes, this came up in terms of compensation and lack of transparency, where in-country staff, often with years of experience in education, are paid less than their white counterparts who travel or are moved into these countries to work. Furthermore, local staff are often not protected in the same way by HR as their foreign peers, who often have extensive benefits and support. We should note that this description was only shared in the scenario where white staff from England, Canada, and America travel, or in some cases move to countries in Latin America, South Asia, and/or Africa. It was never described for BIPOC staff moving to work in a secretariat office in England, Canada, or America. Furthermore, the responses that were subcoded as inequitable treatment of locals versus international staff often came from third-party perspectives, whereas responses that were subcoded as discrimination in hiring practices and/or limited opportunities for advancement were more likely to be reported by those directly affected. This may be the case because inequitable treatment of locals versus international staff is more visible and can be witnessed by other parties, while discrimination in hiring practices and/or limited opportunities for advancement are often experienced between few people, the applicant or employee, HR management, and sometimes leadership, and may not be visible to the larger organization. A number of respondents also mentioned how complaints to HR management about discrimination and racism were often disregarded or pushed aside rather than addressed. So there's little room for recourse for employees who experience discrimination firsthand or even witness it secondhand. Next slide, please. The third indicator that came up 123 times in written responses was leadership. The subcodes highlighted included power imbalance, lack of accountability, neo-colonialist structure, and board compliance and accountability. Next slide. The majority of incidences of this code was of witnessing racism, 81 instances, where respondents highlighted the significant power imbalance and neo-colonialist structure of global development organizations, where white-dominated leadership is the norm, and where assumptions of employees of color and employees from the global south are less capable and knowledgeable than their white and Western counterparts run rampant. Many respondents detailed individuals in their leadership positions using their power to appoint unqualified white people from the global north over BIPOC people or local staff. Other respondents highlighted the lack of accountability when it comes to racism in the workplace, where HR and leadership often push aside accusations of racism, gaslighting, and often pushing out those who accuse them of discrimination and racist actions. The Global Mapping Survey data results demonstrate how deep-seated racism is in the global development sector and how it shows up in multiple ways throughout multiple organizations and spaces through structure, culture, programming, and communications. This is just the first step to building the Racial Equity Index, and the Racial Equity Index Working Group will be delving more into each of these 11 indicators and more into the next phase to build this index. However, this snapshot demonstrates how dire the need is for the global development sector to be held accountable for racial discrimination and racism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantel and Graciana and Alyssa, for taking everybody through all of the work that we have been doing, throughout the past year. We've covered a lot of information, and I know that for some of you, this is the first time that you've interacted with this full data report and our work, but I would love to hear if anybody has any questions. And so far, I don't see anything in the Q&A box, but if you do have a question, please raise your hand. I can then move you up, if as it were, to a speaker, just so you can ask the question, and then I'll move you back into the audience, or just put your question into the chat box, either in the Zoom chat box or in the Q&A box. So until we get some questions that are filtered in, or that filter in, I want to ask everybody, especially for all of us here, this has taken, the full and complete data analysis has taken about 6 months for us to do. And throughout this process of the data analysis, we've had to question, how we have approached, how we analyze this data. Can you all talk about, and whoever wants to answer this question, can you all talk about especially these accusations of bias that we've had to move through, and how that's impacted how we approach the data analysis process, and how the data itself then would be received from an external perspective?
I can start. There's no such thing as unbiased research, and there's no such thing as an unbiased person. I think we as human beings are all have some type of bias, and that plays into everything that we do. That being said, I think it is important to identify where our biases are and figure out, I guess, how that impacts the work that we do. if this bias is something that ends up being discriminatory or prejudiced against certain groups of people. And I think there are measures that can be put in place to make sure that work like ours and research is done in a less biased manner. But ultimately, like, we were the ones that identified that there was an issue in the sector that we wanted to look at. That is due in part to our own biases and our own perspectives as people of color working in the sector. And that's not something that I think we should or can just drop. Like, I will, yeah, I guess I will gladly say that I am biased and that this research has some sort of bias, and be okay with that because of the perspective that we're coming from.
I think something also to note, like, about our process is, as Graciana alluded to, is that at every sort of step we engaged in like critical reflection and discussions as a collective, and engaged in these conversations with our peer reviewers as a way, as a part of our approach, right? Like, so thinking, thinking about our positionality and then translating that, like, what does that mean in terms of how we do this moving forward. And something else that I think is really important to point out is that it's always intriguing to think about the accusations around bias around this work, and where they're coming from and who they're coming from. It's really easy to sort of be critical around, our collective and our group, but I sort of encourage audiences as well as those who are engaging in our work. It's like, if you have a specific and critical comment about what we're doing, also take a moment to examine where that's coming from. Is it somehow trying to diminish our work as a BIPOC-led collective? Does it have to do with the fact that we're a group that is predominantly comprised of individuals who identify as women? Also, be really reflective and think about where your criticisms are coming from, because we are, as we've said, part of our experience and part of our work is grounding it in transparency. And so we have been extremely open in the work that we're doing, and we are extremely receptive to opportunities to engage in critical discussion to move this work forward in a meaningful way. But I also encourage others who are engaging in our work to take a moment to examine, your biases as well.
And just to add a little bit to what both Gratiana and Alyssa have both mentioned is, we are a collective of BIPOC individuals who have experienced ourselves racism and racial discrimination in our 50 plus years in the global development sector. We do not hide that. We do not try and assume that we are not touched by the same stories we're hearing by our respondents. The issue of racial discrimination is not something that we've just seen ourselves. It is the summer of reckonings that the global development sector went through in 2020, just demonstrating how deep-seated racism and racial discrimination in the global development sector is. Should have, was a wake-up call for the sector. And our delving into this research and into this work was really kind of us being fed up with the excuses that no one knows what to do and that this may not be real, and wanting to just demonstrate that, what is this? What is racial inequity? How does it show up in the global development sector? What are the most common ways in which it's showing up? How are people talking about it? And really broadening our understanding of it. So it was ourselves asking ourselves really difficult questions around racial inequity and experiences we're having, but wanting to see if those are commonplace experiences or if this is just something that we've been experiencing ourselves. So, all of this came from personal questions that we then broadened out to the community to try and get a better sense of what this means. And we're not coming at this work assuming that we know all the ways in which racial inequity is showing up and how best to approach racial equity work. We're coming at this through questions and through, inquiry and crowdsourcing and wanting the communities in which we are engaging and who are our colleagues who are out there in the world who are doing this work day to day to be able to input so that we can create a structure that feels better for everyone, that doesn't continue to push out the groups that it says that it's supporting. So I think that, you know, we take more of a community-based approach to research than a traditional research study does. That doesn't make us more biased. That just makes us more honest about where we're standing in it. And so I do think that that's something important to take into account when thinking about community participatory action research versus, you know, traditional research elements, which claim to be non-biased, but we all know historically have not been. So I think that it's important for us to also remember that we are rooted in this work, and our passion is part of what's driving us. That doesn't make us more or less biased than the next researcher. It just comes from a different perspective.
Thank you so much, Chantal, Alyssa, and Graciana, for really expanding on that question. It's something that we've had to discuss internally, this you know, constant, I'm going to call it accusation of our bias as we move through this work. So thank you for expanding on that. One question that I want to ask, you know, we talked about the fact, and we've said it, that the global development sector, you know, is there is a plethora of white women within the global development sector, a lot within the executive space. This global mapping survey, the majority of our respondents, unfortunately, were white women. How are we moving through to ensure, especially within the next steps of what we do within the build of this index, to ensure that the voices that are affected by the systemic racism that is perpetuated by white women in this sector, because let's be real, how are we ensuring that we're actually moving through and prioritizing those voices? And also, do you have any comments about the fact that white women in the numbers that they did responded to the survey, you know, in the numbers that they did, especially knowing what the subject matter was?
I mean, I can start us off lightly. You know, as we said, we had about 32 respondents, 32% of the respondents were white women. That correlates with what we find in the global development sector as a whole, which is predominantly white, and now more so over the past, I don't know, 2 decades has really shifted to white women more so than white men. And it aligns with a sector that is rooted in colonialism, so it's not super shocking. I think we've always, again, we came from this work just trying to crowdsource, get information, see what people in the sector are seeing, thinking, experiencing. And when we noticed that we had an influx of white women who were responding, it demonstrated as well, like, there are a lot of misconceptions of what is and what is not racism. And there is also, you know, it is important, it demonstrates also how people of color's voices often are even overshadowed in work that is about them, for them, by white people who think that their voices also it needs to be heard, and not realizing the power dynamic in that. We are prioritizing, and we have throughout this research prioritized BIPOC voices, recognizing that we in no way are saying that white voices are not welcome in this space. They are welcome in this space, and we continue to make spaces where white voices are welcome. However, we are putting more focus and are actively working for the next phases to be recruiting and working predominantly with BIPOC people in our focus groups in the next phase to really unpack what these indicators mean, what are the next steps of understanding these indicators. because those are the people with the lived experience. It is important to also have the voices of individuals who are perpetuating the violence, however, not as the key decision makers of what these indicators mean and how we then measure them moving forward. So it's trying to figure out like what is the balance and where there are opportunities for us to leverage and to uplift the voices of those who are the least prioritized in the global development sector, who are having the lived experience.
Thank you so much, Chantel, for breaking that down for us and reminding, especially everyone that's on this webinar and that will listen to it later, that our intention and our work really is centered around BIPOC people within global development. We will continue to prioritize those voices. There's a couple of questions that have come in. The first that I want to ask is a question that gets asked often from an organizational setting within global development. How do organizations take our 70+ page plus data report on our findings within global development in terms of the state of racial equity and the indicators, like workplace culture and HR management? How do they actually move forward with the findings from our data report within their own individual organizations? Any thoughts on that?
I can get us started. I would say that there are so many creative opportunities to spark discussion and conversation around some of the themes and topics that are emerging from the findings from our data report. For example, if your organization has some type of employee resource groups or some type of affinity groups or mentorship groups, these are really important topics that could be engaged in discussion. It's also an opportunity to think about how do organizations sort of collectively come together as a workforce to sort of propose ideas around discussion and conversation to leadership and management levels. You could sort of consider thinking about that as a form of collective action. I also would just invite folks to just at first just really just disseminate the survey, really help us get it out there. Send an email chain to your to staff that you're working with, post it on LinkedIn and across social media, because one of the really important another really sort of important piece of this work is that it's intended to spark and engage conversation, and so really just encourage everyone to help us get it out there.
I would say also really importantly, talk to your teams. It's a lot of DEI work is happening now, and I'm noticing so many of my colleagues in different nonprofit organizations or in international NGOs are, especially if they are people of color, there's an expectation of them to carry that work. It is not the responsibility of Black and Brown people in an organization to then carry the organization into a space of racial equity. Especially if that work is not getting paid extra, because it is an extra burden on BIPOC individuals to take on this work without any pay or without any real support. And it's also, if leadership is not, actively questioning themselves in that work and actively looking at their makeup, the makeup of the board, the makeup of, who are the advisors of the organization, so on and so forth, then nothing will change. And so much of the work that's happening now that I've noticed is people have really cool ideas, but are struggling to figure out how to implement them, mainly because they're not looking at the foundations of their organizations. And the foundations are based off of white supremacy. And it's essential to start asking yourselves really critical questions of, not just how we can fix it. Where did we start? How did we come about? And were we rooted in white supremacist culture? Do we prioritize productivity over the wellness of our staff? Do we prioritize white voices over the voices of BIPOC staff? Do we use the excuse that we struggle to hire BIPOC people because there are very few out there? Then maybe your hiring practices are not right. There are a ton of BIPOC people in the global development sector or who are trying to come into the global development sector. And that's not a problem if they're too few. It's that our hiring practices explicitly shut BIPOC people out, and we have to be twice as qualified as anyone else to even walk into the space. And just, yeah, recognize who are the voices in the room and who is being heard the most. Start to ask yourself the hard questions, because that's really where it starts. And people, before you even start thinking about how you're going to implement all these DEI structures, like, ask yourself some really difficult questions.
Thank you so much, Chantal. Another question, one of my favorite topics of conversation lately with our collective that has come in. If I understood correctly, you were all volunteers. You have understood correctly. Fairuz, we are all volunteers, and we do this in addition to our full and complete lives and jobs. I'm wondering whether or not you have tried to raise funds for this work, or if you choose not to. Oh, the stories we could tell. I'm going to open this up to my collective members, but I'll probably chime in as well with some of my experiences. Anyone want to start this off?
I mean, I would say that Uma is actually the best person to talk about this. But yes, we are actively and always trying to raise funds. I don't think any of us think that this should be unpaid work. We put in a lot of hours, and I think anyone who is involved in this work deserves to get paid for it. Who and how much funding is available is a separate question. I will stop there.
I mean, yeah, exactly as Gratiana said, is we've been fundraising for over, I mean, our existence for for the entirety that we've been around. We've been fundraising, and Uma and the development team has put everything into that. There are funds out there, but funding a BIPOC-led organization, and I can imagine that other BIPOC-led collectives or organizations out there can understand where we're coming from. It is super difficult to get funding from a funder or from even an individual when you are a BIPOC-led organization. There are so many organizations doing DEI work, doing measurements of racial equity on their own, or I guess they're not that many, that are white-led that get funding. But for some reason we struggle. And we've been in many conversations around funding, and so far we have yet to find a funder who is willing to take the risk and really, put money towards something that is going to hold them accountable. So, Uma, I'll leave it to you to answer more.
Thank you for saying that, Chantal. I think the funding sector needs to take a really good, hard, long look at the fact that many of them say that they are working to advance racial equity within their foundations, and their private, like working to increase the scope of what they do in terms of racial equity, but then they reify the same harmful systems that we've always been up against. As Chantal said, there are white-led racial equity initiatives. I mean, they didn't even start off as racial equity initiatives. They started off maybe as gender equality initiatives or other kinds of initiatives that now, because of July 2020 and everything that has happened since, are now focused on racial equity, and they are getting funding for their racial equity work. So it's not for a lack of trying. The reality is that we are holding, what we are building is an attempt to hold the global development sector accountable for the systemic racism it continues to uphold. The honest answer to why we can't raise funds is because the global development sector does not want to be held accountable, and that includes foundations, right? So what we are looking for are radical funders who are willing to get in this trench with us to understand that the only kind of systemic change that we will actually see happen is if there is collective action around this, and not just from this amazing collective that we have built, which includes our peer reviewers, but collective members from philanthropy as well that are willing to really fund this kind of work that is done from a collective decision-making model that is non-hierarchical, that is led by the people who are closest to the problems and therefore have the solutions, right? Like literally, this is the type of work that funders claim that they want to fund. And yet it is the most difficult to get funded because the global development sector does not want to be held accountable, right? Because we will, at the end of the day, when we are done building this index, start to also look at the role of foundations, you know, in racial equity conversations. So again, it's not for our lack of trying. We are out here raising money. If you all have contacts, send them our way. You know, if you all are you know, involved in some sort of you know, funding circle, get in touch. We will be happy to join in on a conversation with you all. So with that, I'm going to close off the questions because I do want to just take you all through like where we're headed next, and close out the rest of this webinar. What you have seen in terms of the global mapping survey and the full data report is just the first step in the building of this index, right? So we've been through the first two steps in the building of this index. Now where we are headed is the focus groups, and that is really where we need capital. Well, we needed capital this entire time because we should be paid for our work, but we really need capital for the focus groups because we need to be able to remunerate people and pay for all of the qualitative data analysis that will come as a result of the focus group discussions that we will hold. And so we will go through the focus group discussions. We may or may not move through a detailed survey, and then we will build the index. It's our hope that we move through every single step as intentionally as we have done throughout this process. So that means that we will take our time because we know that the responsibility that we bear for the build of this index is high. And we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to, you know, all BIPOC people within global development to do this in the right way, you know, in the most intentional way. And so with that, I want to take a moment and thank our amazing collective members and all of you for joining us today. We encourage you to take the time to read through this full and very comprehensive report. And as Alyssa said, please share it out with your networks. There's been so much sweat equity that has gone into this. I cannot even tell you all the amount of time, effort, and energy and, you know, sleepless nights that have gone into this work by this collective. And this is not even adding the mental cost of this work, right? Because all of us have experienced racism, and now we're reading all of the racist, you know, experiences that came through by the 800 survey participants that talked about the racism that they have experienced. So we haven't even talked about the mental cost of doing this work. So read the report, share it out with your networks. We invite you as well to learn about the work of our BIPOC-led collective. Follow us as we work to build the first BIPOC-led and built index for racial equity in global development. You can find us on our website, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and we wish you all well. Take care, get some rest as you end the rest of this year, and thank you for joining us, everybody. Bye.